My name is Claire. I live in Jamaica Plain, on a street where maples and lindens lie down on the cars like wet dogs, heavy, obedient, smelling of sweet rot. In early September, the morning damp forces its way through the windows, and I turn on the oven even if I'm not going to bake anything. The heated air dries the kitchen better than the old dehumidifier under the sink. When the oven rustles, the house sounds like it's breathing. It helps me stand up straight and not reach for my phone. The skillet is already warm. I dice the onion fine, not into transparent petals like in pictures, but into uneven cubes so the browning comes in steps. A crunch here, a melt there. On the table next to me are little cups with measured portions of salt, garlic, tomato paste. The habit from restaurant training hasn't weathered, mise en place, and at least you look like your life is under control. I'm cooking sauce for lasagna and persuading myself it's for me, not because I have to prove to someone I can build layers and wait for the right moment. The phone vibrates. I recognize that rustling tremor, even through the pot lid. At first I think it's a notification from the neighborhood chat. Mrs. Whitaker from across the street likes to warn about the tow truck if you forget to move your car for Tuesday street cleaning. But it's not her. On the screen, a familiar blue frame, a little heart, and the name of an account I never followed yet still see. We still have friends in common. Under the image, 4 words. Double blessings this winter. Double blessings. December. The tone of the white ultrasound printout, grainy like a bruise. The black silhouette of 2 heads inside, next to it the date and the coordinates of a clinic in Brookline. And next to that, his hand. The upside-down thumb with a scar from a childhood fall off a bike. He always hid it. The smile on the girl they call Madison doesn't look like a smile at all. It stretches in thin threads toward her temples, as if the skin can't keep up with the idea of happiness. In the comments, hearts, fireworks emojis. From his sister, "Can't wait, Uncle Mode X2. I don't scroll any further. I turn off the gas. The onion breathes. I stand and listen to the bus out on South Street. The driver always taps the brakes a little early, and the tires moan. I should stir the sauce, but I'm holding the spoon over the pot and counting breaths. As if I reach 20, this will all cancel itself out, and I'll go back to being just a woman with a set of pots, not a figurine in someone else's announcement. 20 ends. Nothing cancels. Ethan left 3 months ago. Not left, more like slid the ring off his finger and set his cup in the sink, as always without rinsing it, as if the coffee stains on porcelain were somebody else's concern. "I don't want kids, Claire," he said. "I thought it was temporary, but it's my forever. You're wonderful. You deserve someone who wants this as much as you do. I'll only get in the way. I don't want to be a bad husband." He delivered it evenly, like he'd practiced in a mirror. I silently pushed a towel toward him, and he dried his hands. Glossy, careful gestures. Such a polite wreck that there's nothing to grab onto. In the first weeks after he moved out, an unexpected simplicity settled in the apartment. My plates stayed where I put them. Mourning didn't spread around the noise of his shower. Nobody left a damp t-shirt on the back of a chair. I started selling homemade pasta through the neighborhood chat. Starting Saturday, fettuccine and ravioli. Sauce, your choice. People came, paid cash, left compliments about the balance of acid and cumin. In the evenings, I read the community property agreement and pondered where the border ran. Who would get the cheese grater? Who the cast iron skillet? We agreed on no war. Separate accounts. No lawyers' paperwork. We're adults. Adulthood smelled like oven cleaner. The image with the double shadow hit like a door slamming from a draft. Supposedly no one's at fault, yet you still jump. I set the phone on the table and notice my hands are shaking. Not attractively. My finger brushes the jar of nutmeg. It falls and rolls under the fridge. A dull sound, like spare change in the subway. I squat, grab the little whisk broom, pull the jar back, wipe the floor of the reddish dust. Not from the jar, from the dried chilies nearby, and find there, behind the leg, a scrap of paper. Receipt. Birch Street Clinic, last December. I was at my parents' in Connecticut that day, and he'd said he was working overtime. I don't save old things on purpose. The fridge just likes to collect strays. On the receipt, the doctor's name and the patient's last name. M. Hart. Madison Hart. I'd seen that name in the comments under his running photos. Instead of overtime, a fertility consult. And that was before our I don't want kids. Surprise drops down like a cold lump, like a stone into water, and from it a clear crack runs all the way to the bottom. What if all he told me wasn't about fear, but about choice. I wash my hands, though I haven't dirtied them, and look at my reflection. Tired eyes, salt crusted in the corners, from nights you sleep with the lamp on. The kitchen smells of fried onion and metal. I crank the oven up still higher so that old school chemistry seeps out. Heated air, a little plastic, a little dust. I take my laptop, open our shared cloud account, the one we promised each other we'd leave after the split. He hadn't left. I'd dragged my feet too. The activity logs show a folder called Projects, and in it, nothing important. But there's a folder raw, and inside, a short video from our entry camera, saved on a day I came home late and missed him. In the video, it's him and a girl. Night, February. Snow squeaks under their shoes. The camera catches motion, and the light comes on. He holds her by the elbow carefully, the way you hold something fragile, and opens the door with our key. She laughs silently, as if her mic is off. She slips inside, touches his shoulder, a gliding motion. At that moment I was calling nearby, on a missed call, asking him to buy milk. Almost a comedy. The video lasts 7 seconds. I watch it 8 times. The next day, I called Heather. Heather's my friend from college, now an attorney in a small firm in Roslindale. She's always known the difference between academic honesty and convenient honesty. "We're not going to throw dirt," she said after listening. "We'll stack facts the way you stack lasagna. Layers that actually touch. Do you really want to go into this? Because if yes, there's no turning around halfway." I said yes, not because I wanted blood, but because I wanted to reclaim the outskirts of my voice, the places where you can speak normally without chewing the words. First thing, we suggested exchanging keys by mail. I wrote briefly, to the point. He called a minute later. "Claire, can we do this without drama?" "I'll swing by when you're out and grab my stuff." I was standing over the pot of tomato sauce, watching the bubbles rise and catch the light. "What does without drama mean?" I asked. "Quiet? Or without witnesses?" He sighed, then asked me, not to make it complicated. I sighed too. Then I hit record on my phone. I always give notice because Massachusetts is a 2-party consent state, and I won't cross that line. "I'm recording this call," I said. He froze a second, and then spoke twice as evenly. And then those weeks began. I kneaded dough and read his company's handbook, a small architecture studio in the South End. The HR policy document had more bullet points than my recipe notebook. Romantic relationships between supervisors and employees or contractors are prohibited. Mandatory conflict of interest disclosures required. From her description, Madison worked there as an intern. I found her LinkedIn. Fresh graduate, internship, thrilled to be part of the team. I closed the laptop and went to wash the mixing bowl. No dirt, just water and flour. 2 weeks after the Instagram picture, we were invited to his niece's birthday. Ethan's sister decided to be above the situation and invited me too. "Your family," she said in a voice note. Family is a notion you can wrap anything in, like aluminum foil, leftovers from yesterday's dinner and a chunk of nameless resentment. I warmed to the idea. Maybe we could skip the docket number. Heather and I picked gifts at Target, took a marker set, a science kit, and a book about space. I baked a carrot cake with cream cheese frosting. The cake came out shamelessly beautiful, and I was afraid it would look like a statement. But I didn't bake it to make a point. I baked it for the girl. Everything went smoothly. The yard was full of voices, the smell of chlorine from an inflatable pool, grilled hot dogs, sticky fingers. Ethan arrived later than promised with a bag from a kid's store. Madison came with him, in a long, loose dress, neat as the first line on a resume. She already had the beginning of a belly. Her hair smelled like something expensive, maybe jasmine. I saw Ethan's sister tense up as if she were trying to smile and bite a lemon at the same time. I went to congratulate the birthday girl, handed over the book, and the child hugged me around the waist with sticky hands. "Thank you, Aunt Claire," she said. The word aunt rose to the surface and drifted past like a leaf on water. The first 20 minutes we kept our form. Then someone suggested a group photo, and Ethan's sister asked Madison and me to stand on either side of the birthday girl. I felt a hot wave rise from somewhere behind my back. Not jealousy, laughter. Laughter that's forbidden here. I held it in by biting the inside of my cheek. The camera clicked. And at that moment, Ethan stepped closer to me, as if he were about to say something, and bumped the drinks table. Cups rolled. Lemonade splashed onto Madison's dress. She gave a startled cry, not from pain, more a pregnant woman's reflex. I instinctively offered a napkin. Someone shouted, "Careful!" Someone ran with a towel. And suddenly from behind, Ethan came. "Claire, step back. You're too close." The tone as even as that day in the kitchen. Several people turned to look at me. Madison held her belly with her palm, real worry in her eyes. I stepped back. Ethan's sister said, "It's fine." But it wasn't. The words ran past each other. "Did you come here to provoke?" he asked me, lower now, but loud enough for those nearby. "You know what condition she's in." "I came to a child's birthday," I answered. "With your permission to be an aunt." He smirked. "You know this isn't a game." Half an hour later, the police arrived. Someone had called. Officer Delgado, the smell of leather belt, a mild fatigue on his face like people who've seen the same thing 100 times and keep hoping this one will be different. They politely, always politely, asked if we could speak separately. Madison said she needed air and water. Ethan stood with his hands clasped like in a company newsletter photo. They had a statement about a possible threat. They asked to see my bag. In the bag, napkins, keys, hand cream, a small cake knife in the cake box. When I pulled out the box, someone in the background gasped like in a cheap play. I explained it was a cream cheese tool, not a weapon. The officer looked, nodded, too quickly. "We need you to leave for today," he said, "to de-escalate." I left. As I was exiting the neighborhood, I stopped at Dunkin', bought a black coffee, and sat until it went cold. On my phone screen, a message flashed. Petitioner's counsel has requested a temporary restraining order. Hearing date. In a week, I set the phone on the passenger seat. A lipstick mark remained on the lid, brighter than I usually wear. In the rearview mirror, I saw my teeth. The front incisor with a micro crack I'd promised myself I'd fix someday. From that evening, I stopped leaving the oven on just to dry the room. I turned it on for a reason. I weighed everything to the gram. Though I used to love improvising, I started cooking my case. I wrote Heather. They're saying aggression. I had a cake knife in my hand. I left at the officer's request. They want an order. Heather replied, "We'll answer. Bring any records, calls, messages. You need a timeline. And please, no independent moves. We play by the rules only." I taped a sheet of poster paper to the fridge, drew a horizontal line, and started marking dates. February, the door camera clip. March, his "I don't want kids." July, he carries out boxes. August, the double shadow post. August, the birthday. August, the police call. Peripheral people kept my life in balance. Mrs. Whitaker brought pumpkins and asked me to help set up the baby monitor for her granddaughter. The password had somehow been forgotten. My neighbor Ray showed me how best to clean a coffee grinder with rice. Mrs. Patel from the first floor invited me for cardamom tea and shared her pakora recipe. I noted how their hands moved slowly and precisely, how they measured salt with the same pinch every time. The peaceful activity, cooking, was my shield. While I chopped carrots, I didn't think about being labeled dangerous. At the district court, hearing it smelled like metal, wet umbrellas, and vending machine coffee. People sat on plastic chairs tapping their fingers on their knees. When they said my name and surname, my stomach tightened, not with fear, but with the readiness to take the position for pain if it struck. The judge was a woman with short hair, eyebrows a fine arch as if drawn with a pencil. Petitioner's representative, a lawyer whose smile didn't rise above his teeth. He spoke with confidence. Respondent has shown signs of obsessive behavior, appeared without notice, made remarks. He pointed to a page where words lived apart from events. Heather stood, and I saw her gather her hair into a ponytail, always before saying something that drops the room temperature. "Your Honor," she began, "our reply will be simple and limited to facts. A party to which my client was invited. No threats, no attempt at physical contact. Officer Delgado's note. Situation resolved, parties dispersed. No messages showing aggression from her. On the contrary, we have a series of petitioner's communications asking to keep it simple and do this quietly, as well as a phone call recording made with notice. And one more detail. The petitioner was the supervisor of the young woman who is now pregnant with his twins, and we have a copy of their HR policy. We're not making moral judgments, but it goes to who is intrusive here. On the last page, a printout from respondent's home entry camera, dated February. We aren't litigating its content, just fixing chronology. She laid out the documents like lasagna sheets, in the corners, neatly, without shaking. I sat and counted breaths. The judge asked questions. Any direct threats? No. Any physical contact? No. Any grounds for a temporary restraining order? A silence a millimeter longer than comfortable. No. The gavel wasn't needed. I left the courtroom. The hallway was as cold as a basement with a chest freezer. I took out my phone. There were 2 messages from an unknown number. Happy now. You always ruin everything. Then, we'll talk. No lawyers. Like human beings, I didn't answer. I went home, put water on for pasta, and wondered what would happen if I showed up at the Sunday market in Brookline with my spinach ravioli. I went down to the basement, where it smelled of damp and cardboard, and pulled out a folding table. I wasn't planning to do anything illegal. I was planning to live. And that was the preparation for revenge. To live well. Better than the script they'd written for me. Meanwhile, I gathered layers, copied correspondence, printed screenshots, attached them to the timeline like garlic slices to a layer of sauce. A few days later, a woman with a soft voice called, introduced herself as Emily from HR at that studio. We received an anonymous letter, she said, indicating a possible relationship between a department head and an intern without proper conflict of interest disclosure. We'd like to speak with you as someone who might be aware of the chronology. I hadn't written any anonymous letters. I don't like pillows stuffed with old feathers. I can provide dates, I said. Dates only. Emily thanked me and sent an official request. I sat at the table, opened my calendar, and carefully, slowly transferred the dates into my response. No evaluative words. Meanwhile, Madison wrote long posts about gratitude and anxiety. Sometimes a line slipped out that resonated in me like a metal spoon striking cast iron. A and I dreamed of this. He always wanted a big family. A and I. Sometimes I ached to write her a single word. When? When did he want it? Before or after my mixture of flour and water I nurtured like a child. I didn't write. My revenge had to be without contraband sugar. Only salt, only heat. Escalation began as meaninglessly as everything else. One morning when I was peeling carrots, an email arrived from a man named Steve, the last name familiar, a partner at that firm. Subject confidential. Inside, a short text. We would appreciate your presence at an internal meeting as a witness if needed. Your information helped us identify a violation. The manager in question used corporate email for personal pressure and broke our confidentiality policy by sending ultrasound images to third parties without consent. Please keep this confidential under the letter. An accidentally attached chain. Misforwarded. At the top, Steve writes HR that Ethan sent me a copy of the date analysis where the discrepancies are obvious. He mixed up the address and blasted it to a general list. Also there, 2 of his emails to Madison with subjects, fix this, and I need this to go away. He addressed her like an intern. You understand this hits the team. He hadn't just broken policy, he'd shown how he works. I sat with my palm flat on the work surface as if I could stop the flow of words that way. I read and thought about how he always overrated his deafness, how he thought life was a hallway where you can walk sideways and never brush the walls. That day, Ethan called. His name lit up on the screen and something clenched inside me. Not where the pain is, where the cold is. What are you doing? He asked. You do understand I could lose everything? I looked at the window where the green leaves were reflected and said, You chose everything. He went quiet. Then he whispered, I just didn't want kids. I answered, You made them. The public point landed at the baby shower Madison's cousin threw, an event with pink and blue pastries, balloons, the proper banner, 2 peas in a pod. I wasn't going to go. Why would I? But the owner of the catering service I sometimes worked with got sick, and I was asked to cover, You can do mini quiches and profiteroles, and the deposit will be wasted otherwise. I went. I made tiny goat cheese and thyme tartlets, opened bottles of lemonade, laid out napkins. I wore a black apron, my hair in a bun, my gaze stubbornly unfocused. The way people look when they can be overlooked. It's convenient. Guests laughed with cautious joy. News of twins always looks like a ticket to 2 rides at once. Madison shone the correct amount. Ethan was more flustered than usual. His tie had veered 2 centimeters left. When it was time for games, one of the friends proposed guessing dates and weights. They brought out a big board and wrote predictions with markers. Someone said, a pre-Christmas present. Someone else, 2nd week of December. I stood by the profiterole tray. I didn't participate. Then the speech started. Madison's sister, Casey, I think, took the mic and said, We're so glad dreams come true. especially when you've been walking toward them for so long." She said it a bit too confidently, and for a second the phone camera of one of the guests caught the wrong light. The screen flared white like an ultrasound. I'd seen that hand with the scar in the comments. I set the last profiterole on the platter and realized I didn't have to do anything. Everything was doing itself. Right after the shouts of hooray and hugs, Steve walked in, uninvited, irritably polite. Next to him, Emily from HR, her face at tired double. "I'm sorry to do this here," Steve said, "but we need to talk, Ethan." Voices dulled as if someone had turned the music off. "This is inappropriate," someone observed. "Inappropriate was earlier," Steve said, and his voice didn't rise. It drove in like a hammer to a nail. He pulled Ethan aside by the entrance, and I heard, without wanting to, the endings. Failed to disclose. Pressure. Conflict of interest. Temporary suspension. Investigation. People who seconds ago were writing with markers were now holding them like popsicle sticks. Madison stood still, like a statue of pregnant justice. Someone whispered in her ear. She nodded. Then she looked at me. No accusation. No request. Emptiness, like between cake layers when you forget the frosting. 2 days later, a link to a local news item dropped into the building chat. South End architecture firm places department head on leave over suspected internal policy violations. Contract termination under consideration. Under the post, comments from people whose job is to love public falls. I closed it because I'm not interested in the sweet taste of someone else's sugar. I was interested in salt. Legal. Simple. A week later, the court called me. On another line, child support services. "We need your signature next to a document confirming you don't object to joint funds being applied to your ex-husband's obligations." I signed and drank water. It tasted like iron. Madison texted me that same day. "I didn't know," the message said. "Or I thought I didn't. He told me you'd been apart for a long time, that you didn't want children. It's the other way around, right?" I set the phone on the table. I didn't owe her an answer, but I answered. "Yes," I wrote. Then after a pause, "Take care." She wrote that she was leaving for another firm to avoid working with him, and that it's better this way. Better for whom, I thought, and realized I didn't care. That was the moment my involvement ended, not because they no longer deserved my attention, but because my attention needed me. In the fall, the leaves really do lie down like wet dogs. I bake bread on Sundays and sell it at the market. Officer Delgado stops by, in plain clothes, smiling shyly like a man you've seen in uniform and are trying to redress in your mind. "How are you?" he asks. "Layered," I answer. He laughs, though he isn't sure it's a joke. Mrs. Patel brings me a jar of mango achar and teaches me not to fear heat. Heat is also a way to feel you're alive. I nod and cut the onion a touch larger than necessary. In early November, Ethan writes, "I'm leaving. For Portland. There's a project. And that's it." I look at the screen and feel nothing but a strange gratitude for the period. I reply, "Good luck." He writes, "Sorry." I don't type back for what, because I know he's not the kind who can form that sentence, and I'm not his teacher. The next week a letter comes from the court. The divorce case is closed. The property division agreement takes effect. The cast iron skillet, the grater, the pour-over dripper stay with me. The oven, obviously, won't float away. At the end of November, I'm invited to Heather's for Thanksgiving. Her house smells of sage and butter, and her laughter is like warm bathwater after a run. Around the table, people talk about movies, about cases. Someone brings up the question, why are lawyers always... It no longer concerns me directly, and I accept that as a gift. When we eat pie, I notice how I'm holding the fork, not with the heel of my palm, but neatly, with my fingers. Like someone who no longer needs to pretend she's not shaking. I step out to the porch. It's cold, but not the kind that makes you shiver. In December, when my whole street is draped in lights and plastic reindeer, a message pops up in the chat from Mrs. Whitaker. "Hi all, tow truck Monday night." And also, "Claire, your bread is the best." I set my dough to ferment and listen to empty footsteps run along the radiator. The same day, another message arrives, from an unknown number. Short. They were born. I stare at those 2 dots on the screen like tiny profiteroles. They were born. Full stop. No names, no waits. I don't ask. I wish them healthy sleep. But to myself. Then I roll up my sleeves and start rolling out the dough. Long, even strips you can breathe along. In the spring, I get a little corner in the cafe on the corner. Clarets, pasta, and bread, Saturdays only. The owner's name is Luis. He has a hummingbird tattoo on his forearm and the habit of listening to people all the way through. He says my ravioli always have the right salt. I smile, and it isn't work. Sometimes people who used to be ours stop by, greet me awkwardly, buy pasta, add, "How are you?" I say fine. And it's true, because fine isn't worse than happy. Fine is when you know the oven works and the curtain doesn't smell like scorched cloth. One day Madison comes in. She looks quiet, like a library at midday. In her arms, 2 bundles in a carrier. She orders bread and black olives. She looks at me and almost whispers, "I owe—" I set the paper bag in front of her. "You don't owe anything," I answer. She nods. "He didn't go to Portland," she says suddenly, as if describing the weather. "He stayed for a project, but the project was pulled. We're not together. He's trying to be a father. Legally, he's a father. Practically, I don't know." I nod. "Are you okay?" she adds. "Layered," I say. She flashes a small smile like someone who's found the right term of art. "Thanks for the bread," she says. Leaves. In the evening, I chop the onion a fraction larger than usual. I think about how the word revenge is like chili pepper. It has flavors, shades, a smell. Sometimes it burns and you feel alive, but sometimes it warms you and you simply stop freezing. My revenge consisted of very simple things: precise dates, clean edges, tidy tears, polite replies, complaints filed on time, proper testimony. I didn't pull a knife to stab. I laid it on the table and invited people to look at its edge in the light. Someone's hand trembled, and he cut himself. That's all. In May, I finally called the dentist to fix that incisor. The clinic smells of mint and fear. Dr. Wesson, a man whose gloves fit his hands like a pianist's, asks how it happened. I say, "Old story. Nothing criminal." He laughs and says criminal stories are a rarity for him. When he places the tiny filling, I feel another crack seal up. One a little cold water might have seeped through. I look at my reflection in the checkout mirror. My face is still mine, just different makeup. At the end of June, I go to the Arboretum with a plastic container of cooled lasagna, leftovers from Saturday. I sit on the grass and think how everything always looks beautiful from a distance. The ridges on the surface, the crust, the proper geometry. Inside layers. The world exists in layers. I take off the lid and breathe in the smell of tomatoes. My phone pings with a notification from the building chat. "Anyone know a good Tyler?" And another, from Heather. "Case closed." "He's been terminated," I write. "Thank you." She sends back a hands together emoji. I go home and sit at a table I don't share with anyone anymore. I cut bread. It falls into ready, rounded pieces, doesn't crumble. I gently sweep the crumbs from palm to palm. It's my favorite motion because there's no dramaturgy in it. It's one of those motions no one teaches you. You just do it until you understand where the table ends and the air begins. By evening, a fine rain starts, the kind that can't bring itself to become a real storm. I put the kettle on. On the stove, it hisses like an old cassette. On the windowsill lies a nutmeg, the one that rolled under the fridge and came back. I pick it up and hold it in my palm. It smells like wood and something faintly charred. I think how I could tell all this differently, louder, with shouting, with breaking plates. But my voice doesn't work that way. My voice is like an oven. If you turn it up too high, everything burns on the outside while the inside stays raw. I prefer low heat. It takes longer, but in the end, you get something you can eat. I pour tea and look out the window. The light from a car driving down South Street pulls apart into long white threads on the wet asphalt. In the window across the way, a curtain stirs. Mrs. Patel's cat has settled on the sill. I lean my palm against the warm flank of the kettle. The house is quiet. My chest too. This isn't victory and not defeat. It's a kitchen after a long dinner. Crumbs on the table, warm water in the sink, a pot on the stove with the flame off, but still holding heat. I take a towel and wipe the table slowly. Tomorrow, there'll be a new layer. For me, too. In spring, when the lilacs in the arboretum stand like a wall and smell so thick you feel you could spread the air on toast, Luis from the cafe called me. I was kneading dough for ciabatta, the radio whispering the weekend forecast, flour lying on the countertop in even snow. No breeze, no tracks. "Claire," he said, "the little nook next door is opening up." The rug cleaner's moving out. Want to try Friday evenings? Your pasta, wine under my license, little tables. I'll ask the inspector. He's kind, likes jazz and anchovy sauce." He spoke gently, like someone offering not a solution, but a chance. I hung up, turned the dough in my hands, so the seam landed underneath. The yeast whispered their own language. "Fridays," I said out loud. The word sounded like a coin dropping into a glass jar. I set the bowl on the warm oven, covered it with a towel, put the kettle on, and sat to write a shopping list. My revenge plan had already been shelved and was tired of its own weight. New shelves were needed. On Friday evenings, people began to come. First two, the elderly neighbor couple who always argue about whether my lasagna's edge is crispy enough. Then four from the accounting office nearby, all with the same lanyard badges, laughing like they talk in fork tines. Officer Delgado came too, in a plaid shirt, a wide wrist, wearing a watch like a Marine. He ate quietly, thanked loudly. Luis spun records, Coltrane, sometimes Miles. Jazz tightened conversations into a taut skein where every word was equally important and equally trivial. One of those evenings, Madison stopped by. No stroller, alone. She wore a denim jacket with a loose thread at the elbow, her hair in a bun, the kind of fatigue on her face that doesn't ask for pity, but simply states the number of waking hours. She took the end table by the window, where the bulbs reflected like fish in an aquarium. I brought water. "Hi?" I said. "Hi," she answered. "I have half an hour," she added, as if apologizing to someone invisible. We didn't talk about him. We talked about the children, in the plural, like the weather. "They nap in shifts," she said. "That's fair," I replied. She smiled without lifting her eyes. "I went looking," she said suddenly, "in my phone's memory. For when it all started. There's always a trace. You talked about layers. My layers are albums." I nodded, though I didn't know what to say. "I didn't come to apologize," she added. "I came to eat." I remembered how often people come to eat when words sit in your throat like fish bones. She ordered spaghetti with lemon and butter and a glass of cheap Sauvignon Blanc, the kind we keep for people who want wine but not somebody else's story glued to the bottle. She ate quietly, intently. When she left, she drew on her napkin 2 tiny circles connected by an arc. She labeled it, back to back. I folded the napkin and slipped it into the jar with the receipt rolls. The paper smelled of lemon. Meanwhile, the legal water flowed, neither high nor loud. Heather wrote, "Hearing on the debt split is done. He takes the car loan and the remainder of his student debt. Court-approved child support arrangements. You're free." I read those emails like a weather report. Light rain in the morning, clearing by noon. Sometimes odd messages came from unknown addresses. "Are you happy now?" Short, like a ruler striking a desk. I didn't answer. No incidents. My revenge was still low heat. One morning, on a day I was sorting boxes of summer dishes, my father called. He rarely calls. Mom usually texts with emojis and dog pictures. Dad prefers silence. "I was reading," he said. "What?" I asked. "The paper. About that firm. I wouldn't say they're good people," he mused. "But we don't rejoice, right?" His voice was like an old oak, rough but sturdy. "We don't rejoice," I said. "We just eat dinner on time." He snorted. "Mom's making ratatouille. Will you drop by?" I promised to come for the weekend. And I did. We ate ratatouille with white bread, and no one said the word Ethan. Sometimes silence is not emptiness, but the proper sauce. On the cafe corner stood a white kiosk that sold oyster chowder on Saturdays. Ray loved to go there, tall, stooped, in his eternal Red Sox cap. Everything he said sounded like a stage direction in someone else's story. "Heard," he said once, stirring Tabasco into his chowder, "that he's leaving. Not for Portland anymore, but Austin. They say architecture's got room to run there. New neighborhoods. Old mistakes I realized I didn't care." The geography of his path no longer arranged a pattern on my table. "It's hot there, I think," I said. Ray nodded. "And humid. Pasta sticks there." We laughed. It wasn't spiteful. It was like commenting on the forecast. At the end of summer, the city inspectors came into the cafe. 2 of them. A man with a folder, a woman with a measuring tape on her belt. I always get nervous when people with badges approach my stove. They asked to see certification, licenses, the temperature log. I had everything by the book. Thermometer sanitized, fields filled in, stickers on containers as fresh as a sprig of mint in a glass. Clean, the woman said dryly. Of course, Louise replied. She cuts onions with a ruler. They left, and I was left with a feeling of cleanliness, not just on the table but in my head, like after a good shower. Autumn entered the city like a good waiter, unnoticed, yet everything at the right time. Leaves in Jamaica Plain fall as if someone up above is straightening the edge gently. I started teaching the little neighbor girl to bake cookies on Wednesdays. Her name is Emma. She has thick-framed glasses and incredible patience for the way butter shifts from warm to soft. We stood by the oven and listened to the cookies crackle when they came out, and I caught myself thinking that's the right sound. A sound that doesn't need words. And then something happened you could call an echo. It was October, a rainy Saturday, when small ponds gather under every window and people like to look at each other's reflections. He walked into the cafe. No warning, no call, none of those preface words that wouldn't change anything anyway. He just came in and stopped by the counter where I was rolling dough. He wore a dark coat, rented seriousness. He hadn't gotten older, hadn't gotten thinner, not worse and not better. He was the same, an assembly of recognizable angles and habits. On the knuckle of his thumb, the same old scar. Luis looked at me over the espresso machine, raised an eyebrow. You got this? I nodded. How can I help you? I asked him in the flat voice they teach in support desk trainings. Can we talk? He asked just as evenly. I lifted my eyes to the clock. It was 4:15. I'm plating at 4:30, I said. 5 minutes. He nodded, sat at the table by the wall. I wiped my hands, took off my apron, and sat across from him, so there was a square of tabletop between us, the kind you could fillet a fish on. I'm leaving, he said. In a few days. I nodded. Wanted to say... He trailed off, as if choosing a word without a label from a bag. You shouldn't have. What you did. He seemed about to add, to me, but stopped. I didn't do anything to you, I replied. I did it for myself. He looked at my hands. You've gotten harder. No, I said. I've gotten tidier. He tugged at the corner of his mouth, a gesture of habit, not emotion. They're beautiful, he said unexpectedly. The children. I shrugged. The comment had no addressee. Madison, he began. Don't, I cut in. Of all the people on earth, I'm the last address for your report. He nodded like he'd turned in a paper and received a C. Just, he said, already rising. If someday... No, I said. And that no sounded not like a door, but like a light switch. The room got a bit quieter. He stood another second, then turned and left. There was a crumb of dough on his coat. I didn't mention it. The door closed. The bell jingled. Luis pressed the double espresso button a little louder than necessary, as if the machine could carry on doing our punctuation for us. That evening I walked home not along South Street but through the courtyards, where it smells of wet earth and gasoline and your steps feel softer. The first real leaves rasped underfoot, the ones that sound like thin paper. In the apartment I turned on the oven, not to dry the air, but to roast eggplants. While their skins blackened, I opened the cupboard and pulled out that same little jar of nutmeg I'm always misplacing. It smelled tart, like an old wooden windowsill. I grated a pinch into the sauce, not because I had to, but because I could. The next weeks were quiet. Sometimes quiet is scary because you hear your own footsteps in it. Sometimes it heals because you hear your own footsteps in it. I started getting up earlier, 5:40, before the city noise, when the street sleep hasn't been shaken off. I chopped onions and noticed I'd stopped crying from them. I simply wet the knife with cold water, and my eyes stayed clear. Maybe that's all it ever was, doing simple things right. In November, Luis and I put on a small pasta and jazz evening for 10. I wrote the menu on the chalkboard. Pappardelle with beef cheeks, ravioli with pumpkin and sage, onion tarte tatin. Delgado came with his wife. Her name is Maria, and her laughter is something you want to pour into a glass. Mrs. Patel came, sat at the edge, carefully folding napkins. Those accountants came, without badges this time. Madison came, for half an hour, as always. At the end, Luis put on Round Midnight, and it seemed to me that was the best smell in the world. Sugar, butter, wet coats, and a brass horn, speaking for everyone. A few days before Thanksgiving, I drove to Connecticut. Mom brought out Grandma's china. We're always afraid to break, but take out anyway. Porcelain, thin cups, a twig pattern. Dad hugged me longer than usual. At the table, they told me about the neighbors, about the dog Betty, who learned to open the fridge, about a new bakery on the corner. No one asked, "How's he?" I said good. And that too was good. I drove back through dusk, the kind where the white lines on the road are the only logic. The radio was talking about next week's snow. I thought, if it snows, I'll bake gingerbread. At my building, I unloaded the bags and climbed to the 3rd floor. On the doormat lay an unstamped envelope, just Claire. Inside, 2 tickets to the ICA Museum for 2. Open date. And a note. Thank you for the bread. M. I leaned against the wall. This thank you didn't require action. I stuck the tickets to the fridge with a pear magnet. In winter, the city speaks differently. Tires whisper on snow. People talk through scarves. Doors knock more softly. My schedule now had Friday evenings. Not as a project, but as a habit. New people came. Old ones left. I learned to set the water to boil 10 minutes before the rush and to forgive myself in advance for oversalted ravioli. Once. I stopped watching his accounts. Not out of pride, out of boredom. In January, Madison called me. It was a short conversation, like the inhale before a dive. They've cut their 2nd tooth, she said. They take turns growling at the spoon like little engines. I laughed, though I wasn't sure if I should. I found a nanny, she added. I'll be working from February. Part-time. At another firm. Everyone wears hoodies and doesn't pretend they're redesigning the world. That's right, I said. Will you drop by sometime? She asked. I will, I answered. And in fact, the next Tuesday I brought her bread and a small jar of onion jam. She opened the door, smelled of milk and lavender. The babies lay side by side, back to back, like in that drawing. I set the bag down and left quickly, not because it hurt, but because it was warm. February stamped its seal on the city, thin ice on sidewalks, sharp sounds. I noticed that when I chop onions, sometimes they sting again. But now I knew what to do. Look away, bring the back of my hand to my nose. There it smells like flour and it burns less. A silly, small trick. Such tricks, it seems, are what life is made of. In spring, I started saving for a little pasta machine, the kind with an electric drive so you don't crank the handle when the line gets long. Louis set a jar on the counter for the dough motor, and people began dropping in fistfuls of coins, sometimes folded bills. On the jar I wrote in marker, low heat. People asked what that meant. It's our style, I said. As for how his life went on, I know less than I know the weather in Portland. Someone said he left after all. Someone said he stayed. Someone else said they'd seen him at the airport with a suitcase the color of wet asphalt. The news no longer contained his name. Neither did my head. Once every few months a joyless thought arrived. What if? I'd put it in the oven with the bread. 40 minutes later I'd take it out and tap the crust. A dull sound means it's done. The thought cracked, and I ate it. It wasn't tasty, but it didn't poison me either. In summer I hung a little sign above the cafe door. Clarets, Fridays 6 to 10 p.m. People photographed it and posted it to their neatly sliced lives. Sometimes familiar names surfaced in the comments. I didn't open them. I learned to live with layers the decent way, not spilling the filling onto the tablecloth, not skimping on cheese, not rushing to take off the pan. Revenge turned out not to be about him. It turned out to be about me, about the right to stand in my kitchen and cut onions the way I like, about the right to say no, like a switch, and yes, like incoming light. On the last day of summer, before the rain decided to return, I stepped onto the stoop with a cup of tea. The air smelled of mint, hot wood, and something sweet. Probably Mrs. Patel was frying bananas with cardamom. I leaned on the railing, looked down South Street. The bus again braked a shade early, and the tires groaned. Somewhere on the 2nd floor, a neighbor practiced trumpet scales, and the notes snagged on the leaves. In the window across the way, the cat slowly lifted a paw, like a conductor. I thought how my voice really is brass. It doesn't scream, but it holds a note for a long time. I went back to the kitchen, pulled a slab of dough from the fridge, smooth, warm under my fingers. Put water on, salted it without tasting. The hand remembers. It boiled, as always, fast when you look away. I slipped in the sheets, stirred with a wooden spoon, not metal, so it wouldn't scrape. Just then, the phone buzzed, brief, like a fly against glass. A message from Madison. They fell asleep at the same time today for the first time. I cried. From happiness and quiet I smiled into the empty room. I typed, "That's the best sauce." She hearted it. Not the kind of heart from those comments back then. A normal, small one. I turned off the stove. The water's noise died. The house was warm, not because of the oven. Warm in the way that isn't dangerous. I sat at the table, set down the plate, showered it with parmesan. There were a few crumbs on the table. I swept them palm to palm, the practiced gesture, meaningless and full of meaning. Outside, someone hurried past in the rain with their hood pulled over their eyes. Inside, I lifted my fork. It wasn't a finale. It was a service, and I was ready for seconds.